I'm here today with Justin ECKSTEIN. Good to have you here. Making the trip out from Tacoma here to Vanderbilt. Really appreciate you sitting down with me. Justin is an associate professor of communication studies at Pacific Lutheran.
Yeah.
Appointed also in the graduate program in communication studies at University of Washington there in Seattle. So Tacoma, Seattle, meeting up there. And so you did your PhD in communication studies at the University of Denver.
Yep.
Yeah. MA before that at UNLV.
Yeah, Vegas.
In Vegas, baby.
Yeah.
And before that was a comm studies at Denver.
At Denver, yeah.
So it's Denver.
Unified.
Yeah. So so you specialize in arc theory. Work on sound, affect. Do some stuff on taste.
Yeah, so generally I'm interested in the senses and the history of the senses.
Yeah, and then how we then make inferences and inform each other about it. So
Yeah.
what got you into this?
Well, taking a step back into argumentation writ large, I was a debater, and I kind of identify as a debater. When I argued a lot as a child, my parents threw me into debate at like 13. So I did it through high school, and that brought me to the University of Denver, where I was a competitive debater. And then I did it through graduate school through comm, and they give you assistantships to run debate programs. And I just kind of naturally found my way into some argumentation theory. But it wasn't until I returned to Denver to run the debate program I used to be part of that Darren Hicks, who was the original person who recruited me to be a debater at Denver, became my advisor and really introduced me into argumentation theory, starting with pragmadialectics.
It's a good place to start.
Yeah, right.
Hey, out there.
Yeah, the original gateway drug.
Yeah,
to
dark theory. Yeah. That's a good place to start. It's 10 Commandments. Come on now. That's a good place. That's good. So a question like, okay, so you really took to debate. Was there a sort of a shift, or was there a kind of a skill shift that went from like, I'm good at it to I teach it? It happens regularly with folks where it's like being good at it doesn't necessarily mean that that you'll teaching. So tell me about the shift that happened between being interested in doing debate versus teaching debate.
Well, I would say that I wouldn't claim I was ever really good at debate. I mean, I was adequate.
I've gone back and forth with you. You're better than I am.
Well, you're very nice. I was adequate at it, and then when you complete your time, they offer you assistantships to be a graduate student and help run programs. So I liked coaching it. I thought it was fun, and you can be something called argument coaches, which is where I actually learned to write papers. Okay. But there was this moment where I learned to love teaching argument theory, and it was with Darren.
Okay.
I remember I was teaching in his art class, and he's like, he pulled me aside, and he's like, look, everyone's going to need you to teach argument, and people don't really teach argumentation theory.
Yeah.
And we sat down, and we started reading, the 3 perspectives of argumentation theory, and looking at what informal logic was, what pragmadialectics was, and it was just so fun starting to understand these approaches. And I remember when I took that class as an undergrad and definitely did not do great. But like how hard it is, how interesting, and how important it was. Like, oh, you mean there's these 2 different definitions of this word argument that we use interchangeably all the time,
right?
And how the slippage could impact us, and it just became fun. I don't know.
So let's talk about the 2 different senses of argument. And so in some ways, argumentation is supposed to, in some ways, reflect that difference. So we've got argument in a formal or a sort of a propositional sense, but then we've got another perspective on that.
Yeah, there's some that refer to it as an exchanging, like as a verb, right? Or the sort of abstract, right? Proposition, as you just said.
Yeah. So thinking of it as a relation between pieces of information versus a relation and an exchange between people. So you throw the people in there, things get a little bit more complicated than just the formal relations between pieces of information.
Absolutely.
And so one of the ways that when you throw people in there that we complicate things is that it sounds like our affect. The way, so it's not just the fact that we're exchanging information and it goes back and forth, but in fact, some of the information that we give is in how we give the information, the affect. You've done a lot of work on how sound is doing this, and one of them is you've got a kind of a fun little pun or double entendre with some recent work on the Greta affect.
Oh, the Greta affect.
So explain, do the long arc of the explanation of what that is.
Sure. So I'll take a couple steps back, right? So I subscribe, in argumentation theory, I subscribe to a particular version called normative pragmatics, right? And normative pragmatics presupposes that when somebody makes an argument, or people are in the process of making arguments, there is an after, right? Let's say the process of exchange can operate as a cultural resource that is taken up, and it could be used by others. So let's say we have a disagreement of some kind and it produces an outcome that others may use as evidence, or they could use it as an example, so on and so forth. This is relevant insofar as Greta, climate activist, gave a speech at the UN in which she made claims. How dare you?
You have to say it a certain way.
How dare you? To the people let down her generation with climate change. And it was the particular intonation of her voice that gave it the appeal it did. And what I was interested in is how that intonation moved people. And it was particularly polarizing because of her innocence, and whether or not she was given innocence, whether or not it was seen as she was smug, or whether or not people saw her being, they were let down. So I was interested in how that particular feeling manifested on the internet through The Simpsons predict the future, and the way that collective intelligence sort of created this set of memes in which they changed out Greta and Lisa as the same, to say, look, this has already been foretold.
The Lisa Simpson voice made flesh in front of the UN Council. So so the polarizing effect. Let's talk about one of. So there's the Greta effect, E.
Yeah.
Which is that there were consequences of it, but then there's the Greta affect, which is how she spoke. And so that's the little double entendre. Super fun little move there. Yeah. But so let's talk about how it was polarizing. So what were the what was, we kind of saw what you saw about the negative one. Tell me about the positive.
Well, some people really felt called and mobilized along the acts of youth. Yeah. Right, for the first time. Actually, this is the second time. I've traced this in some other work to the Parkland kids, where they said that the previous generation has let us down, therefore you need to cede the moral high ground to kids as the leader. And Greta actually cites the Parkland kids as the reason she makes this specific argument in How Dare You in some interviews. But that's the argument. And some people are like, how proud they are of her to stand up and say what she believes. Other people are like, how dare you? What kind of kid tells us what to do? Right? And so it is that sort of division that makes it so affective, right? That's so polarizing. But a lot of people found it, mobilizing and as a reason to do stuff.
And so they're pregnant with meaning. Sound, though, not just the things we say, but how we say it is pregnant with meaning in this regard. Well, one of the other ways and so in some ways we have someone delivering a sentence with certain affect, and the sound that it has there. But then there are other sounds that don't really seem to have any propositional content. Like there's no sentences there. You've done some research on the Belarusian sound bodies and the use of clapping as a gesture of protest. So how is sound that's not associated with any proposition going to be communicative and maybe even serve these argumentative purposes? Tell me about these sound bodies.
Yeah. Well, so I think to understand what a sound body is, we have to take a step back and understand what a sound is. So with the case of Greta, it makes sense because it's a person you're seeing delivering a speech, and you're like, oh, that totally makes sense. It depends how you define sound, right? And an important part about how you define sound is I come from an approach that is called acousmatics. It's tied to a French composer. I promise it's worth this long story.
Okay.
And then
got the arc in. Okay.
Yeah. And then we'll get back to how this relates to a protest movement. Essentially, when we talk about sound, oftentimes we refer to sound of things. Like you hear the sound of, keys. Right, but this doesn't enable us to understand the intrinsic sound of something. what it actually sounds like. It only makes it a secondary feature, the sound of the keys, as opposed to what it actually sounds like. So there's this composer named Pierre Schaeffer who's really interested in getting at what the sound actually is like. So he went around with a tape recorder and he would record sounds, and then he would play with the recording to try and get away from what the originary cause was. And he was inspired by Pythagoras, actually, in the way Pythagoras would teach behind a curtain, right, to his disciples to dislocate the origin, right? And the idea being this would force you to attend to the sound itself, the sound as such, right? And this became relevant between the tape recorder and the dislocated origin in our contemporary moment of digital media, because so much sound is reproduced all of the time without us knowing where the origin comes from. Are you with me?
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Yeah.
It's like that the screaming hawk in the backside of all those movies. It's like that's the sound of a hawk.
Yeah, that's Foley. Right.
Yeah. Good. Okay.
So basically, we're often surrounded by sounds that we are unable to attribute the cause of.
There we go.
And so we ascribe it meaning through representational categories. The thing is, we often are uncomfortable not knowing where the cause is, and there's a tension there that we want to attribute to agency, right? You would probably know the answer to this. Was it first cause St. Thomas Aquinas that talked as a justification for God?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the 5 ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Like there's this.
There's got to be a cause for that cause.
Yeah.
we are explanation seeking animals for sure.
Yeah. So there's this like tension. And so that is what it creates this notion of an imaginatory supplementation, which is prime for rhetorical explanation.
Got it.
Right? And so bringing us back to
Belarus, back to the sound bodies.
Sound bodies. A sound body describes the desire to create imaginary supplementation for sound you're hearing. So when you're hearing clapping, for you, if you are somebody that is against the regime, you're all of a sudden noticing other people agreeing with you. So what was not ever iterated is now being spoken aloud, and it's providing material realization for a spoken or a clapped realization that there are people who are against the regime. And for the regime itself, it's notifying them as well.
And the important thing here is that it's not spoken word. It's not a sentence or something like that. It is a gesture of solidarity.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I would actually argue that it is in fact an argument because it's defiance. There gets to a point where they said they can't even be in public out there making sounds or making noises. But what it is it's so fast that it becomes difficult to assign who it is. Right, and so it plays with a lot of the lines of absurdity, because if you're just...
What did that mean?
What did that mean, right?
Yeah.
But it redefines what is appropriate place and space of the citizen and who gets to define where that is, while they're in a place where they can face serious repercussions and harm.
Yeah. So one of the things is that it looks like it's a pathway of indirect communication. We say something without saying it. We communicate something without saying it. And importantly, we communicate something without saying really anything. That's super interesting. And it's public. And it looks like there has to be some intellectual work happening in the background for people to be able to follow that. You have to be able to kind of see that. There's some other intellectual work that's sort of public in this way, that big ideas are being communicated in small moments, and it's the phenomenon of the celebrity chef. That tastes and the development of taste and talking about taste is a place where we think about ourselves. Tell me about how you think that celebrity chefs then are public intellectuals.
Yeah. Well, backing up 1 second.
Yeah.
Something that's important with both of them is both with the sound bodies and with public chef intellectuals, which is different than a celebrity chef.
Oh, got it. Okay, ready?
The essay creates a distinction, but they have to be intentional about what they're doing, right? So even what was happening with the Belarusian protests, there was digital content that was disseminating, saying what was happening.
Got it.
Because intention is important. Otherwise, how do they know you're going to persuade them, right?
Yeah.
This is not imaginary effect. So I want to put that out there. They made it dispersed and distributed, not attached to a specific person, but the imaginary was attached, that when the claps would happen, they knew what the association or attachment was.
Okay.
The rhetorical imaginary. To get to public chef intellectuals, what's important about that, what makes them an intellectual versus just a celebrity chef, is the acceptance of other intellectuals or other technicians.
Okay.
Is the argument basically made. So like any other technical sphere. And we were really interested. This work in particular got started on people like Dan Barber. Dan Barber is a chef out in New York at Stone Barns. He's done a bunch of stuff. At ISSA, I presented an argument about his honey nut squash, in which he grew for taste as opposed to shelf stability.
Great.
Right? Like most produce is grown in a way so that it can maximize the supply chain, and then it can sit on a shelf and maximize profit. He grew these, so they're shorter, they're more condensed, they have thinner skins, so they can't last as long, but they taste better, they're denser in nutrition, and it really forces you to question how far your food comes from. Or he did a pop-up restaurant called Wasted, where he only served detritus from the food that we consume, right? And it enthematically asked us to question what is food versus what is waste, which is a common question in a lot of food consumption. What is considered the best versus the worst is largely based on circumstances, right?
So tell me how the enthymeme then works.
Well, it's not. It's unexpressed. The unexpressed premise.
There's an unexpressed premise, and so what's the unexpressed premise?
So, for example, if you were to dine at Wasted, which was a pop-up he covered the entire space in ramée. And so ramée is a plastic that they put on top of crop to stop it from freezing. And it, in this sense, was repurposed into design, and it is opaque, but you can kind of see through it, right? In this sense, this design element stood for the claim that you can now sort of see into the whole supply chain of food, because you're seeing from the very beginning where they had bits and pieces of like, you know, the mushroom tables to the very end, which is things like tallow candles and stuff like that.
Got it. So so we see something from the inside of a process, and so part of this is about, you might say, not just having some theory about this, but also talking about how these insights have got some uptake with particular audiences. We have this with the Belarus Project, we've got it with the Greta Effect Project, and now we've got it with this intellectual, public intellectual chefs, not celebrity chefs. Hey, so useful distinction, but we've got a lot of the theory about A, what's happening, and B, about uptake. Some of the other applied work, the whole reason why you're here at Vanderbilt is in some ways because of that theory meets uptake phenomenon, because you're here with the Vanderbilt Civil Discourse Lab working in this debate and dialogue project. So tell us a little bit about what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a lot of work that where the rubber meets the road. I'm here helping implement, as you said, the Civic Lab, which is interested in teaching students how to accommodate differences of opinions. So when I was a debater, we were really interested in teaching students how to advocate a position to learn critical thinking skills, regardless if they believed it. Here, we're interested in teaching students how to advocate what they believe and to be able to listen to people that they disagree with, to build civic resilience. And that involves learning how to identify conflict areas in classes, how to be able to identify what they believe, and how to identify under what conditions is appropriate to change your mind.
And so you've got a lot of rubber meets the road projects happening on campus here at Vanderbilt. So tell us about what that looks like.
Oh, well, right now we're meeting with a bunch of different faculty. We're trying to get a sense of what their needs are and ways that we can help support them implement these sort of things into their class.
Great. So there's where some rubber meets the road, the classroom, and then hopefully beyond. So tell me about your classrooms. What classes do you teach, and how does this research impact how you're bringing this to your classroom?
Yeah. So I right now am teaching public speaking, which I absolutely love. It's one of my favorite classes. Fun fact: I don't grade, and I'm very proud of that. I do a a form of grading where it's the number of speeches they want to give determines their grade. So you want an A, you speak more.
Okay.
I'm teaching an innovation class right now. We're working with the Tacoma City Council in redesigning how we understand safety, which is really interesting, right? Like if you have kids, the way you define safety is different than if you're like an adult, right? One has to do with concrete, and another has to do with how you define violence. That's this semester, and I'll be teaching Introduction to Comm class, in which I want to, again, go to the origins of communication, which is actually the civic space. Right.
The civic space.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the origins of the communication discipline go back to Cicero and Aristotle.
Playing a role in your polis. That's the reason. That's where excellence lies as a communicator, and having a role to play.
Why we need it. Yeah. You have to learn to be able to, when everyone's coming together, be able to mediate different disagreements and things like that. Have a public conversation.
Yeah. So that's the objective that we've got and it looks like there's a pretty continuous theme running through the research and your teaching and the service that you're doing for these universities. That's a kind of a blessing, isn't it? Being able to see all these things fitting together.
I feel very grateful for it, and sometimes it leads me to a good meal.
Right, that's one of the nice things about getting to bring folks to town, is that you get to show off your best restaurants. What's the best thing you've had here in Nashville so far?
Well, Aubrey's was pretty good.
Aubrey's was pretty good. Okay, good to know. Good to know.
Yeah.
I'll be buying you some pizza after this.
I'm excited about that.
All right. Okay, thanks for tuning in.